but keep getting snacks. Nobody should be stopped from getting snacks. Welcome to the University of Colorado Denver Philosophy Department. My name is Sarah Tyson. I'm one of the professors here, assistant professor here. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Carolyn Cusick, who's an assistant professor of philosophy from California State University at Fresno. Dr. Cusick received her PhD from Vanderbilt University. Her research interests include philosophy of gender and race, social and political philosophy, epistemology, and philosophy of education. And Dr. Cusick has not only written extensively on these topics, but she's used this work to actively address what's called the demographic problem in philosophy, so the problem of underrepresentation of women and people of color in philosophy. She's worked quite hard on that problem. And today, her talk is entitled Listening to Fanonian Humanism, so please help me welcome Dr. Carolyn Cusick.
Thank you all so much for having me. And Sarah's such a great host. Thank you. I look forward to this. So all I sent around, it was just some quotes to keep you maybe along the way. I probably should have numbered them and told you where I was, but I think it'll be reasonably clear. Hopefully we'll pace ourselves. Although officially the opening lines to Fanon I don't directly quote, but I figured if I'm going to quote somebody else referring to them, we might as well know what they are for sure. So really the first one is the middle there from Maldonado Torres. So for years now, I have been worried that uses of the verb to listen come in only two forms, either as calls or as commands. Those called to listen in formal pastoral and professional settings sincerely offer up the opening salvo of I'm listening to patients or clients or parishioners in need of someone who understands and might be able to help in trying times. Busy parents, authoritative teachers, and bosses who get to have the last say as well as their own way, on the other hand, command that others, too weak or marginalized to resist, listen up. Further, when listening is part of academic study, it is concerning primarily professional calls to listen. Even in rhetoric and political theory fields, both where communication is rather significant, most research focuses on speaking rather than also on listening. The expectations tend to come from, or the exceptions, tend to come from feminist quarters, where some, such as Iris Young or Susan Bickford, have begun to show the radical potential of better listening practices. In this paper, I want to follow their lead, and I'll refer to a few others in rhetoric doing similar work, and ask what might happen if the command to listen is made from the oppressed, and the call is heard by the oppressors or the privileged. Of course, the oppressed do not, and could not even if they desired to, issue such explicit verbal commands, but their wounded bodies do command attention. Similarly, the call heard here need not be professional, but come merely from the recognition of injustice and domination, and the desire to correct or alleviate it. Here I explore other practices of listening between those professionally called to listen, and those in power commanding others to listen to them. Practices of listening that are essential for human liberation, and I turn to Fanon for help in making this shift. Frantz Fanon is the Martinician psychiatrist and social theorist whose life, research, and eventual work with the Algerian revolutionaries provides grounds for exposing the contradictions of colonization, especially those colonizing acts in the name of humanism, and for inspiring in us a new humanism. Fanon might not be an obvious choice to describe better listening, especially not specifically to encourage more listening from the privileged. Not only was Fanon's intended audience precisely not the colonizers, but the colonized, but many today view Fanon as a writer specific to a particular moment in history who might not be relevant, or who might not be relevant in the US. However, his repeated appeals to a new humanism, never to a pessimistic giving up on the possibility of recognizing the humanity of all human beings, are precisely why Fanon is essential to any discussion of the role of listening in an achievement of human liberation. I will not here argue that Fanon is a humanist. I'm already pretty persuaded by Lewis Gordon and Nigel Gibson and a few others making those claims. Instead, I want us to listen to Fanon as a humanist in hopes of learning how such listening might be better used in achieving liberation. A brief word on terminology. So Fanon uses many terms throughout the writings, sometimes the black and the white, sometimes the Algerian and the French, and sometimes generically the colonized and the colonizer, or even the native and the European. So my analysis tends to be a lot wider than these very specific situations of colonization. And so I'll refer, when not specifically repeating Fanon's language, more generally to the oppressed and the oppressors. And those complicit in oppression, but maybe not so clearly oppressors, as the general European is to the specific colonizer. For Fanon, I'll refer to them as the privileged. And while I have some reservations about the language of privilege, I still lack a better word to identify those who benefit from systems of oppression, even when they wish not to, but who often live comfortably and often ignorantly with those benefits. So there'll also be a series of quotes, right? Fanon generically uses the term man, and I don't necessarily want to endorse those, but it's his language. Right? I quote him now and again. So how then is Fanon to be read as providing us reasons to listen better? Especially when, regardless of how one might read his discussions of violence, Fanon is explicitly not calling for dialogue between colonized and colonizer, between black and white. He's insisting that, quote, the foreigners must leave. So I argue that Fanon is revealing that the conditions for the possibility of dialogue are not yet present. What is missing? At the very least, that the oppressors, and often to the privileged, will not listen to the oppressed as having his or her own viewpoint worthy of consideration. The oppressor will only command and demand the oppressed listen, and the privileged too often misunderstand the oppressed and are unwilling to make necessary changes to bring about their liberation. We can see this, I'm going to argue, by separating out Fanon's direct and his indirect messages. Directly, Fanon is appealing to other colonized peoples to stop listening to colonizers and to start listening to themselves and to each other. But indirectly, Fanon is at least warning, possibly threatening the colonizers, that the colonized will not be obediently or compliantly listening anymore. So when the oppressed stop heeding the commands of the oppressors and start listening to themselves, and when the oppressors and the privileged start listening to more than just themselves, maybe the conditions for dialogue can arise. But the sort of listening that the privileged need to learn to do will take some work. So I'll first explore Fanon's direct message, right, and then take up the indirect message. And then I want to conclude by way of a return to this humanism about some others who maybe have taken up this listening, all right, and some lasting influences. And those will be through Nigel Gibson's work in South Africa, Paulo Freire, and some Enrique Dussel, right, who have in fact listened to Fanon, right, and how they can then further aid our listening. So first, the direct message, right, about not listening to commands anymore. One noteworthy aspect of much of Fanon's corpus of revolutionary writings is that they are consciousness-raising exercises, at least in part. From the more autobiographical Black Skin, White Masks to the decolonial handbook, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon's writing is meant to inspire, and has succeeded at inspiring, right, various colonial subjects to recognize their own humanity and insist on being treated as such. Right, as well as anybody else living under, control of exploitative, dehumanizing forces living on the margins, right? Nelson Maldonado Torres, in The Cry of the Self is a Call from the Other, describes this as Fanon's cry of ethical revolt. In his very close rereading of Black Skin, White Masks, just the opening few sentences he focuses on almost entirely, and he explains that this cry is indeed precisely that, a sound uttered as a call for attention, as a demand for immediate action or remedy, or as an expression of pain that points to an injustice committed or to something that is lacking. In this particular cry, we can hear, right, how, quote, love loves love and cannot stand its evisceration. Fanon speaks to and for the wretched, the damned. Of course, Fanon is also making clear that these struggles are not individual, but collective, as the forces of colonization and oppression are institutional often rather than merely individual, and have institutional and structural and cultural effects even long after some explicit legal and material changes. Further, if formerly colonized subjects do not fully mature into their freedom, they will merely replicate the structures of oppression in their own communities. That is why it is necessary to stop listening to the oppressors. Fanon makes clear that, quote, because it is a systematized negation of the other, a frenzied determination to deny the other any attribute of humanity, colonialism forces the colonized to constantly ask the question, who am I in reality? End quote. And that is a question that must be answered by turning to oneself, to one's history, and to one's own community, rather than replicating the abusive power relations of colonization and domination. That is a question that needs to be answered by finally seeking a humanism that really is for everyone. Fanon then directs his work to the agency of the dehumanized to recognize their own humanity and act accordingly. For the colonized, to be a moralist quite plainly means silencing the arrogance of the colonist, breaking his spiral of violence, in a word, ejecting him outright from the picture. The famous dictum which states that all men are equal will find its illustration in the colonies only when The colonial subject states that he is equal to the colonist. This is the refusal to obey the command, listen up. It is instead to listen to oneself, to hear one's own voice and the voices of other oppressed people. So I'm here focused on these communicative moments in Fanon's revolutionary writings. It's well worth noting that Fanon is not isolating the power of one's own voice or even one's own ears from the total agency of our minds and bodies. Rather, Fanon's existential phenomenological method describes the lived experience of a being in the world. He treats as integrated and mature human being all our senses and our capacities to make meaning and reflect on those meanings. To that end, one can find in Fanon an important description of racial perception, one that, despite much critical emphasis on the visual, takes the whole of human perception in eyes, ears, noses, mouths, and all the nerve endings in our skin, and which succeeds in understanding the interplay of our senses, as well as understanding the interplay of mind and body. There is rightly, to some degree, much made of the visual in Fanon, especially in this powerful opening of Chapter 5, right, the lived experience of a black man. Chapter 5 of Black Skin, White Masks, where Fanon boldly describes being objectified through the other's gaze. And yet Fanon engages all our senses. Even the visual cues signaled by being looked at by another immediately engage tactile sensations of running not just one's eyes, but even one's fingers over another's body. The tactile included in remarks about hair and skin textures that too often get lost for their emphasis on the visual aspects of skin color. Sometimes Fanon uses the sense of touch metaphorically. For example, in the third sentence there, right, locked in this suffocating reification, I appealed to the other so that his liberating gaze gliding over my body, suddenly smoothed of rough edges, would give me back the lightness of my being that I had thought lost. Here, the sense of touch is present even in its absence, in rules of segregated society that disallow touching across the divide, except, of course, when oppressors touch to inflict physical harm to the oppressed. So too then is touch never far from the surface in Fanon's discussion of race relations and intimate relations of black women and white men, or of white women and black men in the second and third chapter of Black Skin, White Masks. Right. When I read Fanon, I can practically smell the stench of the city, as well as long to breathe the fresh air of the rural land that holds promise for the future. But rather than get any of these particular senses at one time, right, Fanon gives us a richly integrated body, even if it is now a narrative of a body suffering under external constraints and bursting to get out. Just before Fanon laments the loss of the colonized affectivity as cultivated and demonstrated through dance, he writes, so this is a long quote there, right? I don't think this one's on the page, but give me a second to read this long one. The colonial subject is a man penned in. Apartheid is but one method of compartmentalizing the colonial world. The first thing the colonial subject learns is to remain in his place and not overstep its limits. Hence, the dreams of the colonial subject are muscular dreams, dreams of action, dreams of aggressive vitality. I dream I am jumping, swimming, running, and climbing. I dream I burst out laughing. I am leaping across a river and chased by a pack of cars that never catches up with me. During colonization, the colonized subject frees himself night after night between 9 in the evening and 6 in the morning. So without utterly disconnecting all the senses and without privileging one sense over the other, I still want to temporarily at least focus on our ears, right, on the hearing of racialized voices in the quest for humanistic justice. And Fanon makes that easy, not just in the sense that he connects the auditory to understanding by insisting that we must not just hear the sounds others make, but hear them as meaningful, but also because Fanon reminds us of some of the patterns of auditory discrimination. This is most notable early on in Chapter 1 of Black Skin, White Masks, right, The Black Man and Language, where Fanon discusses the role of language of both French and Creole in the identity, perception, and opportunities available to white people, to French Antilleans, and to French Africans, reminding us that, quote, yes, I must watch my diction because that's how they'll judge me. He can't even speak French properly, they'll say with the utmost contempt. These concerns with language and accent are not particular to the French language and the legacy of colonialism. One need only look at the ongoing frequent attempts for U.S. cities, counties, and states to pass English-only legislation, or that supposedly, right, more inclusive English-first legislation, while also taking notice of the ways that some accents elicit positive reactions and others negative, right? Some accents indicate intelligence while others indicate stupidity to us. So to listen to people requires us to pay attention not only to what they say, but how they say it, and the whole of their speaking bodies. And Fanon, I argue, right, provides us a good example of such a careful and attentive listener. In becoming a psychiatrist, Fanon answered a professional call to listen to others in their times of need. In that role, he witnessed much human suffering. He concluded that, quote, a constant and considerable stream of mental symptoms are direct sequels of this oppression. This oppression there is specifically the case of the French occupation of Algeria and the extreme tactics used by the French attempting to maintain colonial authority in the face of Algerians seeking freedom. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon presents a series of cases of psychopathologies, each representing patterns he witnesses working in a psychiatric clinic in Algeria, caused by the conditions of oppression and dehumanization in Africa. While Fanon focuses on the sufferings of the Algerian freedom fighters, he also sees French patients suffering because of the internal conflicts arising from engaging in acts of torture, torturing the Algerians. Still, Fanon's insights are relevant well beyond the particularities of the Algerian Revolution. He's revealing that human beings do not live well, right? That we suffer psychologically, not only physically and materially, when we cannot live under conditions of justice and shared humanity. In answering the professional call to listen to the suffering of others, Fanon concluded that we should not heed the command to listen up to those in power who act against our own best interests. Sometimes those in power do command us to listen in ways that serve us. Right? Sometimes parents and even teachers do know best and use their authority to help us mature rather than merely to maintain control. All too often, though, the listening we do after being commanded to listen up will never be as thorough or as impactful as the listening we do when we choose to learn and to connect with others. Further, the listening done for one's job, even a vocation such as minister or therapist, might not affect the sort of personal and social transformations that both Fanon and many African nations underwent as listening done to seek understanding and justice might affect. We need practices of listening other than professional calls and explicit commands. We need the masses of oppressed to both trust themselves and each other, and we need the masses of the privileged to listen to the oppressed because their voices matter, not out of a duty or a command, but because they have things to say too. And those of us who are privileged must hear Fanon, who shows us not only why we must, but also helps us understanding why such listening is so difficult and why we keep thinking and telling ourselves that we are listening when in fact we are not. Fanon, in the tradition of his teacher, Mises, points out the contradictions inherent in such structural oppression. For example, it's the colonial situation that is violent, taking land and then enslaving natives to extract resources to be shipped home, denying natives any education that does not reinforce hierarchies, destroying communities and individuals. Right? The colonial situation is violent, despite not being acknowledged as violent most of the time. And yet resistance is often called violent, even when done merely to survive. Right? Or there's the contradiction that is the colonialists who claim to act in the name of universal humanism while denying humanity to the majority of the world's inhabitants. Our histories and our habits make listening difficult, for we must first unhear what is common and often taken for granted. Fanon, I argue then, can help us with this if we listen carefully. For it's not to the oppressors and the privileged that Fanon speaks. He's not making a counter-command that we listen, even though the narratives of his wounds do cry out. Right. Some of us, though, we can choose to listen without a command or a call. Right, so now I want to talk a bit more about the indirect message, right, which I call eavesdropping on Fanon. Well, I've been clear that the audience Fanon writes for is not the Europeans or the privileged or the white folk. There is one significant moment when Fanon directly states what is to be done not by the colonized, but by others. He concludes the first chapter on violence in The Wretched of the Earth with the following. This one I think is on the page, right? This colossal task, which consists of reintroducing man into the world, man in his totality, will be achieved with the crucial help of the European masses, which would do well to confess that they have often rallied behind the position of our common masters on colonial issues. In order to do this, the European masses must first of all decide to wake up, put on their thinking caps, and stop playing the irresponsible game of Sleeping Beauty. Here then, my interpretation is that waking up and thinking must first take the form of listening, as an unobtrusive activity of noticing the contradiction of advocating humanism during colonization and the contradiction of race societies more generally, but of noticing then one's own place in these societies. Listening is all too often viewed as the passive counter to the activity of speaking in any sort of communicative exchange, right? Surely there is a sense in which speaking, right, is in fact more active than listening. Speakers get all the attention, right? They tend to set and control the agenda, except where audiences refuse to listen. And even then, sometimes audiences get to do a good job of giving the appearance of listening quite convincingly. Yet listening is not passive, not if one is paying attention, trying to understand, and engaging with the speaker. Communicating is, of course, a mutual activity. Without some of the control that speaking has, though, listening is the more vulnerable role, especially if, as a listener, one is genuinely open to hearing what others say. Right, here's the point that Susan Bickford, I think, makes clear, that, quote, the riskiness of listening comes partly from the possibility that what we hear will require change from us. How, then, should the privileged listen to Fanon? We can take our cues from Jean-Paul Sartre, whose preface to The Wretched of the Earth is precisely an attempt to hear Fanon's indirect message to the oppressors and to the complicit privileged ones. Sartre asks everyone else to eavesdrop carefully on Fanon, who's not talking to us, but to other oppressed people. So eavesdropping is not a term Sartre uses. However, his preface, I'm going to say, is a good example of this purposeful eavesdropping, as opposed to, say, accidental eavesdropping or gossip. And it's this language of eavesdropping that I've taken from some rhetoricians, Krista Radcliffe and Tanji Dreher. So there, right, eavesdropping is this politically purposeful activity where one listens, quote, while standing outside in an uncomfortable spot on the border of knowing and not knowing, granting others the inside position, listening to one. Radcliffe formulates this definition precisely for use by white people to understand whiteness, how it has and continues to operate as privilege, so that anti-racist efforts are not the sole work of non-white people. In this meaning, Radcliffe turns away from the connotations of gossipy busybodies eavesdropping towards a literal meaning of eavesdropping, of standing outside of a building under the eaves where the rain drops on our heads, in order to fashion a rhetorical definition of taking a communicative and epistemic position of outsider, of acknowledging the discomfort of standing outside of spaces one often takes for granted of being allowed indoors, with the purpose of learning more about oneself and others. For the privilege to eavesdrop on Fanon is to listen not because called or commanded, but to understand the oppressed and one's role in perpetuating or fighting that oppression. So Sartre, we'll eavesdrop a bit here, right? Sartre begins his preface by repeating a history of the commands of the Europeans for the natives to obey, repeatedly being met with resistance. Right? He says at first the black and yellow voices speaking on their own to say this, that this so-called universal humanism was not so universal after all. Europeans at first listened enough only to be surprised that they could even speak for themselves. And then they listened nonchalantly and without fear that the colonized would ever be so upset as to revolt. But now, Sartre says in 1961, right, how are the oppressors going to listen? Right, because now Fanon's voice is different. The world is different. And so it's time for Europeans to listen differently, to listen thoroughly. Seems to me by 2015, it's also time for us, right, in the US, especially those of us who are white or economically, epistemically, even communicatively secure, to listen differently too. Let us not forget that in Fanon's analysis of the US, he finds a nation that, given a post-World War II opportunity to assert hegemonic power, chose to, quote, ape Europe, to be obsessed with catching up with Europe, such that, right, the US, Fanon says, quote, has become a monster where the flaws, sickness, and inhumanity of Europe have reached frightening proportions. Such changes to our listening habits, to actually listening instead of just waiting our turn to speak again, will not come easily. Thus, Sartre's words are forceful. He's clear that Fanon's audience is not the privileged, but the oppressed, and Sartre writes. And if you mumble, sniggering awkwardly, he's really got it in for us. You have missed the true nature of the scandal. For Fanon has got nothing in for you at all. His book, which is such a hot issue for others, leaves you out in the cold. It often talks about you, but never to you. But Fanon's topic, if not his audience, is the oppressor and the privileged, because they stand in the way of the oppressed, of liberation, and of realizing this new humanism. And so we too must read this book. We too must listen to those talking about us, while understanding how that is not the same as talking to us. That is why we must eavesdrop, to give them their space to talk about their oppression without having to face their oppressors in doing so, and without seeking our own absolution in them. While eavesdropping, the privileged can learn about herself too, if she can listen to some painful truths. So here's another start. I think this one's here maybe. All right. This book had certainly no need for a preface, especially as it is not addressed to us, I have written one, however, to carry the dialectic through to its conclusion. We too, peoples of Europe, we are being decolonized, meaning the colonist inside every one of us is being surgically extracted in a bloody operation. Let's take a good look at ourselves, if we have the courage, and let's see what has become of us. First of all, we must confront an unexpected sight, the striptease of our humanism. Not a pretty sight in its nakedness, nothing but a dishonest ideology, an exquisite justification for plundering, its token of sympathy and affection, alibis for our acts of aggression. We have to know ourselves through others' experiences rather than continue to impose bad faith versions that blame others for their dehumanization. We do this by listening to their descriptions of their lives and their descriptions of us, and by seriously considering those experiences as valid and ourselves as complicit in their suffering. And yet this listening must not be self-centered. It must be humble and open-minded. This eavesdropping cannot be a secret way to continue patterns of narcissism, of the privilege still making it all about ourselves. These are concerns addressed by both Radcliffe and Dreher. Right? Dreher emphasizes the discomfort that Radcliffe puts centrally into her definition. Dreher's essay is largely a personal reflection on finding ways for herself, a white middle-class woman, and others like her, quote, who are discursively privileged to contribute to anti-racism without dominating the space of conversation. And what she calls this a redistribution of safety and risk. In analyzing her participation in a project that's supposed to disrupt discourses and policies of protecting Indigenous and Muslim women in Australia, right, there's a concern that these discourses of protecting Indigenous Muslim women poses a dilemma, right? So you either have to be on the side of fighting racism or sexism, and thus, feminist liberation turns out to be dependent on perpetuating racism. And so there's a meeting to decide how to participate in this, how to resist, what to do. And Dreher describes how she chose to be an eavesdropper rather than a full participant. She chose to, this is a bit of a long quote, right? Position myself as a listener. I spoke little, and instead tried to listen attentively for suggestions made, points of connection identified, and key points raised. I assigned myself the task of noting these in order to feed them back into the direction of the project, and to make the notes available to those who had participated in the discussions. The goal was not to collect material for my own research or writing, and I rarely spoke about the contents of the discussions with anyone apart from the participants. For Dreher, this means eavesdropping should not just be purposeful, but also with permission. And surely we have Fanon's permission, not only because he published a public book, but he also asked Sartre to write the preface to it, or permitted Sartre to write the preface. Right? There's some interesting history about how it came about. I think we can meet the ethical burdens of responsible eavesdropping as long as it's not accidental or gossipy, as long as we are not seeking secret information to aid our own interests, but are listening with open minds to better understand ourselves and those we are listening to. One last brief caveat then, right? When one is professionally called to listen, they are trained to offer a space of acceptance for the patient's view to be acknowledged and respected, right, as seems to be necessary for therapeutic work. The sort of listening that I'm calling for between a call and a command, though, I'm not sure it requires this foregrounding of acceptance. There's no requirement to agree with everything Fanon or others have to say, nor is there any command issued by Fanon or Sartre officially. Rather, this is listening for justice arising from the pleas of wounded bodies and minds, or as Freire puts it, arising from one's own, quote, involvement with reality. As such, right, I expect that more and more the privileged will, right, believe when they say, hey, that was racist, but that acceptance is not foregrounded as necessary, the way it often is in professional calls. Right. Let us not forget that some of Fanon's psychiatric patients were, again, these Frenchmen whose mental illnesses arose as consequences of being employed as torturers. Granted, Fanon is rightly angry that in one representative case, right, this European police inspector, he says, asked me in plain language to help him torture Algerian patriots without having a guilty conscience, without any behavioral problems, and with a total peace of mind. End quote. Right. So the police officer wants the economic and social security of a job and wants his victims to alleviate his guilt. That Fanon will not grant, will not even tolerate the request. But Fanon will take note that colonization then does harm the colonizers, not just the colonized, even if it harms them in different ways and to different degrees. This too is a point that Freire stresses, as his audience is the revolutionary leaders who often come from the privileged classes, not just from the oppressed. In arguing why liberation must come from the oppressed quite explicitly, right, Freire writes that, quote, the oppressor, who is himself dehumanized because he dehumanizes others, is unable to lead his struggle. Right, thus Freire insists, this one here, yeah. Right, this then is the great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed, to liberate themselves and their oppressors as well. The oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. Only the power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free them both. In this new humanism that Freire is already emphasizing, it's this new humanism that, right, Freire already emphasizes, while Fanon is not yet, right, explicitly concerned with liberating the oppressors as much as with ending oppression. Right, his continual return, though, to the need to forge a new humanism, a new humanity, points the way for Freire, among others who listen to Fanon, directly or as eavesdroppers. Okay, so now to wrap up, let me see if I can make a little more sense of others who've actually heeded this call in some way. Okay. So even in all of Fanon's pointed remarks that he speaks to the colonized, not the colonizers, Fanon never loses sight of his larger goal of humanism. How else will the formerly colonized be assured that they will not recreate or return to such oppressive conditions? That's where he begins Black Skin, White Masks, with declaring that what he is saying in the book is a striving for a new humanism. And by the time he writes Wretched of the Earth, humanism is the driving force, the beginning, and the middle, and the end. I mean, I could pull some quotes from right in the beginning, the middle, and the end, but you get the idea. Right, so still, this humanism is far out of reach for Fanon. He's living in a profoundly divided world, where the world is less officially divided today without Jim Crow and apartheid as law. We still live in a rather divided world, too. The end of much de jure segregation has not led to much reduction in de facto segregation. And while not all separation is bad, and some is good for those on the margins to feel safe and secure, our world is also still divided by opportunities and differential treatments. This new humanism can come for us. We can bring it about, but only when we overcome the contradictions of domination and seek not shifts in power, but fundamental changes to the structures of power. This reflection on the contradictions of a divided world and the need to overcome both sides by construing a new humanism have been heard by many, not only by the formerly colonized and oppressed, but even by some eavesdroppers. Whether it's Nigel Gibson and Richard Pithouse, both white South African academics, and they're working to support the South African shack dwellers movement, right, without dominating the space of those actually, right, shack dwellers. Or Paulo Freire and Enrique Dussel working to transform the living, educational, and political conditions of South Americans. Fanon's words carry weight and have impact on the lived experience of the oppressed and the privileged wanting to end that oppression. The shack dwellers movement arose from conditions of poverty and political insecurity into a political and intellectual movement to generate a new humanism, rather than continuing to live always in a state of emergency. What started as a roadside blockade in Durban in 2005, when promises of land rights were broken, has grown into a large coalition of affiliated settlements that reject party control, cultivate thoroughly democratic practices, and in fact identify themselves as a university. From the beginning, it has been an intellectual project, with the shack dwellers understanding that they are not in need of merely of better housing and sanitation, but of recognition as human beings. They already live Fanon's lesson that, quote, to be responsible in an underdeveloped country is to know that everything finally rests on educating the masses, elevating their minds, and on what is all too quickly assumed to be political education, which means opening up the mind, awakening the mind, and introducing it to the world. It is, as Césaire said, to invent the souls of men, end quote. As the shack dweller elected chairperson, I'm going to fail at his name, Zakode. We'll pretend that's right. My Zulu's not very good. As in, I don't know any. Right, so the chairperson of the shack dwellers movement says, right, we discovered that our municipality does not listen to us when we speak to them in Zulu. We tried English. Now we realize that they won't understand Zoha or Sotho either. The only language that they understand is when we put thousands of people on the street. We've seen the results of this, and we have been encouraged. It works very well. It is the only tool that we have been able to emancipate our people. Why should we stop it? And so the shack dwellers movement continues to organize, to hold open discussion meetings, to publish pamphlets, and to organize petitions and protests. Richard Pithouse and Nigel Gibson, among others, share their messages and their methods with others, especially those who might better listen to white academics than to shack dwellers themselves. They act as go-betweens. But they carefully describe themselves not as leaders in the movement, and not even as educators. They describe themselves as students too, who see in the movement the rise of a new humanism, an opportunity for us to see Fanon and Steve Biko, right, is often referenced here too, as still alive and working to reduce human suffering, to liberate people into lives of full and capable human maturity. So the university, of the Shack Dwellers University is representative of some other Fanon-inspired efforts in education, right, as a force for liberation. For Freire, a pedagogy of domination is a tool of larger acts of domination, and thus a pedagogy of liberation is fundamental to complete human liberation. Right? And Freire writes, quote, "The pedagogy of the oppressed, animated by authentic humanist, not humanitarian, generosity, presents itself as a pedagogy of humankind." End quote. The pedagogy of the oppressed is organized as question posing to develop critical thinking skills, to see the suffering resulting from contradictions of so-called Western humanism, and to find ways to resolve those contradictions in favor of more freedom for everyone, rather than domination. Freire writes that, quote, "Education must begin with the solution of the teacher-student contradiction by reconciling the poles of the contradiction so that both are simultaneously teachers and students." Seems like this is one way to command less, right? Here, Freire is focusing the contradiction between the oppressor and the oppressed into the case of the teacher and the student. Right? We can see such contradictions in the commands of authoritative teachers to rows of students forced for long days to sit in uncomfortable chairs, with all attention paid to the teacher, who then deposits into students information to be recited back on exams. While an exam could be an opportunity for a student to have agency, to use her voice, right, in a classroom structured by domineering commands, writing an exam has the opposite effect. Overcoming this oppressive education is, we learn from Freire, the first step in overcoming larger contradictions of oppressive societies. Just as education can be a tool of oppression, it can be a tool of liberation, when students are also authorized as thinkers with contributions of their own, with rights and abilities to question and either accept or reject what they are taught. From these cases of liberatory education of the masses, right, I want to move to my third case, right, of Dussel listening to Fanon's plea for a new humanism. While the Shack Dwellers University and Freire's pedagogy are actively resisting the sorts of commands I too want to resist, right, to not hear and to not heed, Dussel's ethics and theology of liberation turns to the command upside down in such a way as to manage still to create a new possibility of not merely replicating old authorities with new ones. Dussel returns us to more explicitly practicing of listening between the call and the command, as he terms his political listening obedience, right? So from out of the classroom and into the government, right? What's obligated of our political representatives is obedient listening to citizens. He calls it obedience, breaks down the word in interesting meanings. Where Fanon started in the professional call, but then transforms the call outside of his profession to a call from a general human obligation to love and be responsible for others, Dussel starts in the command to listen up to the people in power, but transforms it into their obligation to listen to the people they represent. In 20 Theses on Politics, which is a condensed version of a lot of Dussel's larger works, he focuses on the structures of democratic communities and how we might organize and inhabit representative governments. So in theory, right, it should actually be the case that direct democracy is the most just form, but large populations being what they are, let's manage representative democracy better. He then identifies power as obedience, wherein the representatives, quote here, right, are elected to exercise in a delegated manner the power of the community, exercise the power of the community in a delegated manner, right? They must do so with respect to the demands, claims, and needs of the community. Representatives do not act from themselves as a final source of sovereignty and authority, but rather as delegates and with regard to their objectives, that is, in favor of the community, listening to its demands and claims. To listen to the one before you, that's the literal meaning of obedience, he says, is to say that obedience is the primary subjective position that the representative or governor or those performing the function of a political institution must have. To be a politician or a leader, or, right, similarly for Freire, an educator, then is to be the one responsible for listening to everyone else and working to meet their needs and execute their demands, not to determine their needs for them without consulting them or to advance one's own agenda. Dussel is here extending and organizing Fanon's recognition that, quote, the masses must realize that the government and the party are at their service. If one is not an obedient leader, then one is exercising what Dussel terms fetishized power, or power as domination. Then, as a professional politician in a just community, one is answering a call that obligates good listening. It is not only for therapists and priests anymore, even if it is not done one-on-one. And while the people do not get to make any demands they want, because they cannot, for example, demand to exclude others from the community, at some point, though, they'll have to recognize that their interests are in relation with everyone else's interests, right? Dussel does give special voice to the commands made by those presently oppressed and excluded, whose lives demonstrate that we do not yet live in a perfectly just community. We'll never live in a perfectly just community. Politics for Dussel is an infinite task that always requires paying special attention to noticing who is currently oppressed and determining how to alleviate that oppression. But again, as Fanon shows us, the oppressed rarely issue those commands out loud. Rather, they can be heard often as silent absences or as wounded bodies. So then Fanon's call to listen to the many suffering, right, to not stop at his own biography and his own recovery, but to be sure to bring everyone with him, is rendered less a professional obligation and more an act of justice. And Dussel's command to listen is turned upside down and issued not out loud by those in power, but issued implicitly by the masses, the community, every person, by virtue of their very existence. Here then, it is not merely between the call and the command that we find more possibilities of listening and a mode of human liberation. It is when we expand the scope of the call beyond a vocation and invert the command such that it also belongs to the many instead of the few, that we can listen for justice. There's still one last dilemma here, for we need the oppressed to listen to themselves instead of the oppressors, while we need the oppressors to stop listening to themselves and start listening to others, to the oppressed. This will work only if we know who's in what group, and if we know into which group we fit, recognizing also that many people lie along complex intersections of identities as both oppressed and privileged. So, right, how do we resolve this? We might at least take notice of how often we speak and how often we feel heard by an audience when we speak. And for those of us confident that we are not oppressors and yet aware that we are not oppressed either, I hope that the idea of purposeful eavesdropping offered here can help. By understanding listening as an active practice, disabusing us of the myth, right, that listening is passive, more of us can make contributions to liberation by listening rather than only speaking. As engaged listeners, we can understand ourselves and each other better and generate the knowledge and perspectives we need to make dialogue and genuine communication possible. But I've clearly been speaking too long, so.
All right, we got time for questions.
I don't know if I can formulate this as a question. Maybe it's more of a discussion point or something. But I wonder if what Fanon would think, or what you think about, the whole kind of whether the subaltern has a voice kind of issue. And it also reminds me of Gramsci and the organic intellectual, that voice, unless there's some autonomous system or institution where that voice can be exercised, that, if you're an employee, you have to listen. It's a matter of survival to keep your job, to understand the needs and desires of your bosses, right? Of course, that's not reciprocal, but so if it's a matter of survival, that your discourse is appropriated to have a voice,
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. So I have certain lingering resistances to be concerned with calling too many things out. So it's really easy to refer to voices that can't be heard as if they're silenced. And I regularly use that language myself, and I have a certain resistance to it, only insofar as I want to make sure that there is still a reasonable distinction between those who literally cannot speak, right, who are gagged or who are, right, dominated in such ways that they actually have no voice at all, as opposed to those whose speech has no force. And so there's this push from Spivak and others, but there's also this, we see this language especially in feminist analysis of pornography. Right, so women are literally silenced by pornography. Their no's are not heard, right? And I'm afraid to call that literal silencing. I'm afraid to say they have no voice, because it takes different work to hear when a voice is actually speaking, but it's not heard or it's always actively misheard. It's different work to hear it and to hear it correctly than it is to ungag people, right, or to offer people actual space. And it seems to me that there is the case that a lot of people have voices that just don't have any power, right, and that it is in fact, right, that what gets in the way of being heard isn't that they can't speak, but it's that they can't be, or what gets in the way of their communication isn't that they can't speak, but that they can't be heard. And then when we call that too close to silencing, which I think a lot of what Spivak is up to does that, I have this sort of pushback. I want, there's a lot of political force in identifying those as if they're the same. A lot of political force. It still seems to me to be descriptively ever so slightly inaccurate that it changes the kind of political work we do. But yeah, right, and that it is true. I want to say that some people don't actually have the power to make commands, right? To make a demand on somebody else is to put your life in jeopardy. And so it can't be a literal command that, right, that these people are making, and yet I think it's our obligation to actually hear those voices as they're intended, right, or to hear that they're even voices, right, sometimes shouting, that we pretend aren't actually even vocalizing sometimes. But that puts me in a sort of weird camp, right, to not want to call it literal silencing, because it seems like it has the same effects.
So, the very end, last lines, seem to be the final kicker, that this Fanon-like listening story, that it works as a preparatory structure to a legitimate dialogue. That was kind of the idea.
Right.
But just to be the devil's advocate as an oppressor, I'm not at all sure why I should do so. There's stories, perhaps, of the policeman who suffers psychiatric trauma from torturing people. But of course, psychopaths wouldn't suffer such a thing. And there's a cost-benefit analysis here. It may make me a little sad, but it's great to have cash. So why should I, as the oppressor, give a damn? Particularly when we think about Africa. The oppressed calling up didn't change Africa. What changed Africa was the end of World War II and the desire by the United States to break apart the empires. Nobody listened to the oppressed. It was, and same as with, say, Indochine. The French didn't walk out of Indochine because of the oppressed.
There have been actual, right,
I mean, we
they
can have
lost some
exceptions.
battles in war.
True,
Right.
but not by listening. They got slaughtered,
Yes, yeah,
right? Nobody listened.
Right.
It was death.
no, this is why most of what Fanon is doing is actually not asking anyone to listen, but saying, right, like there has to be, or there has to be.
So what I'm wondering is this
yeah, okay.
obligation by the oppressor, right? If
Yeah.
this, why? It's great to be the oppressor.
Right.
It's awesome.
Right,
White male, I got all kinds of privilege.
Right.
This is good stuff. Why would I listen?
right, so I guess the optimistic, naive side of me wants to say that there's a difference between the one who knows that and asserts himself, right, and says, hey, I like what I've got, consciously, right, as opposed to that you're supposed to see in that the contradiction that you also value equality. You also claim to be committed to some sort of, right,
So you think
Human
so we're
notions,
thinking
right.
here of this particular, like the particular French sort of case where we have the French advocating equality, the French Revolution, etc., but simultaneously.
not yes, and the same is
But that,
true
of
of
course,
our
is simple.
Constitution.
But
Right.
that's of course is simple to handle. Algerians aren't people. That's how that's handled. It's not a contradiction. They're simply not human. This is the classic move.
Right.
Blacks aren't people, and that's why we can oppress them. Native Americans are inherently stupid, as Thomas Jefferson told us. So there's no internal contradiction because they're not people.
But until we stop making that claim, right? It turns out that we're perfectly able to, but that we're perfectly able to recognize their humanity, even while half the time declaring it out loud. It's not half the time declaring that it is, right? We always talk outside, both sides of our mouths. And the claim here is, so you're right, we can resolve these conflicts in one of two ways. We can fully commit ourselves to believing that we are in fact the only human beings, and that they get to be treated like this. And in fact, I think that we can watch how this is going to happen. I won't be able to talk very smartly about this, but I'm super curious to watch people build robots that we can use to, right, intelligent robots that we're going to enslave. It's coming, right?
No, it's
But,
20 years away.
But, right, so we can fully commit, or we can make the decision to go the other way and actually, live up to the out loud principles instead of the actions. But the history of slavery in the United States contains these very contradictions. You're so dumb you can't possibly read, so let's outlaw ever you becoming literate. We don't have to outlaw it if they can't do it. There's always a recognition at some level that this is a human being. And then there's layers of piles of stuff put on top pretending it's not true. But it's not that we believe it first. We recognize it first and then try to talk ourselves out of it. Right, and so this is the claim that we don't get to continue to try to talk ourselves out of it anymore, if we're going to see ourselves at all as responsible for some of this suffering.
I mean, I think it's there in the Sartre preface, that you put on it, that he's saying that the striptease of our humanism, which is a great image, it's nothing but a dishonest ideology. So the oppressor is being dishonest with himself.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be coming to terms with that is the painful aspect of it.
And so if we're willing to be that bold and not even call ourselves humanists, but just call ourselves powerful pain mongers, then I guess that's not inconsistent. I just don't think most of us are actually willing to do that. Maybe that's naive.
The remark about why does the question why should the oppressor care? Because we've got it so good, which is a good point. But it got me thinking about something, and I don't want to say this in the spirit of the poor oppressors, feel sorry for us. But as I remember, I heard a speaker say once that masculinity is the thing you can't have enough of, and that the oppressors aren't all one person. The oppressors are doing their own little hierarchical thing. And that you have to stay. I mean, partly you get to be an oppressor no matter what. You just get to be an oppressor, even if you're at the bottom of the heap of the oppressors. But there's still this thing, going on among the oppressors. And I think about the fact that when I was young, people still talked about how, men could all be friends, in a way that women couldn't do that because they're all in competition for the other men and for the men, and then they can't really be friends, But men, just have this basic friendship. But beneath that so-called friendship, there was always that competitiveness. There was a little bit of, no man wanted to admit that he was really being intimidated by other people. He had to act like, oh yeah, we're all friends, But it's
Anyway.
Wouldn't the oppressors tend to listen more when their position of dominance was being threatened by other things? Isn't that where it's likely to start?
Well, in some respects, absolutely, right? Yeah. So when you do lose a battle, right? Then but I guess there's a couple of opportunities, right? Do you lose your battle and dig in, throw more weapons at the issue, or do you back off? Wasn't that long ago I heard somebody give a talk and he described, and I haven't decided I'm not a good enough historian to decide on my own. I haven't decided to figure out whether or not he's at all right. The claim was that now is the time for the United States to make a move like the British did in the Suez. It's time for us just to move on, back off, and decide that we don't get to control the Middle East. The British, right? They say, what? We're out. We're done. We're not going to win. Right, we've given it up, move on, and I guess there's a series of moments where the British do this in shrinking their empire. But there's two options. You can fight harder, even if it's inevitable loss, or you can stop fighting. Right, but what happens when you stop fighting? Do you accept defeat, or how do you win also with some kind of honor? Right, and you can win with honor if you can say, right, and maybe you can be friends if you can say, well, right, out of my commitments to something like humanity, right, I'll stop dehumanizing you. And I guess I don't know, that it's still a little ego. I mean, it seems to me there's still plenty of, there's a lot of room for the oppressed and the privileged ego, but it's an ego as living up to my principles instead of the ego as, acquiring more stuff.
I don't know if I've had this question articulated yet, but I mean, when you stop fighting, are there even two sides anymore? I guess in the context that we're talking about this. So I mean, there's almost this caricature of the oppressor on the table, of like white male who enjoys his privilege very consciously, but I think that there's like a new animal emerging today, or that has been emerging for a long time. What is we were talking about is somebody who's potentially ignorant or unaware of their privilege and doesn't necessarily feel comfortable in the role of oppressor. And so there is, and doesn't feel, and the privilege is not outweighed by this feeling of immorality. And so I don't know that it's not so black and white, I think, anymore in this particular conversation, in the U.S. right now.
No, right, we are not, I guess we're a colonized country and a colonizing country. Yeah, right. I mean, it's funny, the history of the United States as being both in a certain sort of way. But instances of colonization, instances of that level of legal oppression don't operate in the same way here as they ever did in Algeria.
Right.
Well, I mean, unless, of course, you're native, right?
Right.
Then it's a whole, then we've got, right, that we still like to consider ourselves, native in this weird sort of way. And it does operate really, really differently in a sense that, right, it's hard to imagine. I don't know who to identify as the official oppressors as opposed to the case that we're already somewhere in between, more in the privileged class that I would say, that seems to me is more open to being willing to listen, even though listening is still quite hard. Right? Because we have very similar things to lose, right? It is the case that the benefits that accrue to people in privileged positions aren't actually that different than the benefits that accrue to the oppressed. Right? It's just that the modes of, the structures that are doing more of the work than the active. It's, I just don't, the way that people talked about race 150 years ago is like, I think even a lot of racists today would find abhorrent. And yet most of us are still not that uncomfortable, thinking that maybe some of these people that the police keep shooting were already in the wrong place doing the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like there's still a lot of question about, even though most of us just we won't talk about other people as if they're not human, quite out loud, except for in thought experiments. There's still so much subtlety to our language that suggests they're less than human. Right? They're not fully human, but less than human, we still will talk about. And that gap, I think, already allows us an in, that I would hope. But
definitely degrees of subtlety though that are almost immeasurable.
yeah, and vicious,
Yeah.
right, and cruel and powerful.
Yeah.
Please.
I wonder, there's perhaps another voice that an oppressor would listen to and have an epiphany, and that's the voice of God. If the spiritual aspect, if they were able to incorporate that, that is a whole different experience than, that they have an epiphany, they change, and then the reaction, the action out of that is to start viewing the oppressed differently. But it didn't come from the oppressed, it came from an internal
Well,
change.
so I mean, it would raise for me a question about, sort of, and I don't mean this in the wrong way, but which God, right? So on the one hand, you've got liberation theology significantly actually influencing free area. It's not just Fanon, right? But that's very different than the God that right, when Emisa Serra writes a discourse on colonialism, he actually says, look, right, colonization was carried on the backs of Christianity. Right, that a lot of these contradictions don't just come from abstract principles of humanism, but they actually come also from, we'll go in there and Christianize, and really the government was going in there to exploit physical resources. So it would have to be the right voice of God.
Right, the right message.
Yeah. But it is true, right, that I think, there is something about the calls of the minister might actually not even quite fully match up to the calls of the therapist, right? There's not just a professional call that a minister hears, right? But it might even be communicating another kind of call altogether. Or a command. It's interesting that that's, that God commands, but God also calls, right? And then, I don't know, I'm not great at religion, but it seems like that's actually a place where those two words that almost become synonymous.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, I have really a local example, and then of something about listening and the skills of listening, and then I want to talk about Hegel. Always.
Okay.
But it's so appropriate here, come on. I mean,
Right, no,
Fanon is like,
it's Fanon, how do you?
it's often not appropriate, but here
But
it
here
is
it's
so
there.
appropriate.
Finally.
One thing is, and this is personal experience with Occupy, one of the, and this is related to listening, one of the greatest kind of insights I had into American political culture is the complete lack of listening skills and communication skills at the grassroots level. And so when this kind of horizontal movement spread across the country and people started to congregate in public spaces and try to come to decisions without leadership or having representation and just come to consensus, all of the burden was placed on them and their skills at listening to each other. And we're incredibly ill-equipped at that as a culture. And we assume so much that we are this democratic people and we listen to each other and there's a marketplace of ideas and we will throw out reasons and
truth will out.
And truth will win out and all these things happen. And then when people are newly politicized, it's different for an academic class who's been trained, often still very poorly, demonstrating these skills, but at least to some degree, they're used to listening to people at length. They're forced to, right? And that's something that most people aren't forced to do or learn. And so the vast majority of people, even in a supposedly democratic country, don't have the basic skills of democratic participation, which one of the most important is listening. And it was really scary, actually, when you saw, and one of the most important victories of Occupy, when it was actually in the form of General Assemblies, was to cultivate and start training people in those skills. And those have carried out into other forms of political organization that still exist, that are still horizontal, and have created rules to cultivate listening. So that's just kind of anecdotal democratic skills, and I think Hannah Arendt is really important in thinking about this. The other one, Hegel, is this idea of the oppressor and them choosing and how good is privilege and whether or not it compels people. I think the Hegelian idea of freedom, which Fanon is taking on to some degree, is that you can't be free unless the other recognizes you. And so, in the master-slave dialectic, if you destroy the other, there's no one to recognize you, and you are not free. And that's, for example, what happened in Iraq. So you destroy any element of the figurehead of the country that's able to recognize the end or the cessation of violence. If that doesn't exist, violence continues. There's no end to it. And so there is this idea that Hegel thinks that freedom is not freedom being independent from others, but recognizing one's interdependency. And so as much as the oppressor wants to be free, they will always produce the contradictions and self-defeating practices that will constantly destabilize themselves, right? And so that's the kind of objective condition that will constantly challenge the oppressor, because the oppressor can never just rest and be the oppressor and be free because the other is subjugated. That relation of subjugation will always undermine them.
Well, this is Sartre's insight in, right, he picks this up in Anti-Semitic Jew in
Right.
a way, right, that's not unrelated. It's interesting though, because I think so, Dussel is operating in a place that's Hegel and Gramsci, to tell his narrative, and it's sort of just, it's a tiny little text that's just the summary version of like, well, 2 of the 3 texts that are forthcoming, right? There's 2 out, and the third one I think is still coming. It's grandiose political theory, right? Written really tightly, but a lot of it is precisely this, to understand, the force of democracy in people. It seems to me that we are very bad even at talking about our understanding of why freedom of speech is actually a right due to us, because in fact we have to be able to listen to the right people, not actually, right? It's not actually a freedom we have for the sake of using our voices. It's actually a freedom we have for the sake of hearing everything we need to hear in order to choose our representatives. But it's much easier for law to operate on the basis of the thing that has agency. And there are ways that we protect voice. Places that we protect listening in the First Amendment, but not actually nearly as much as we do the speech. And we've flipped that upside down. There's some interesting moments in communication studies where people do talk about listening, but really surprisingly weird little pockets of it. And some of it you find in theories of education. Even, we don't train this in school, right? Even wherever, and I imagine it's actually true at this university, but especially in grammar schools and high schools, we list skills that we expect students to have, and of course we need them to have critical thinking skills, and we need them to be able to read, and we need them to be able to have oral expression skills. We always have listening on the list, almost always. I know California even, right, the CSU system has listening skills on the list, and I know most of the public schools do. When researchers get together and calculate the number of hours of instruction on each of those fields, listening always falls by the wayside. I still sometimes wonder if it's a kind of weird default that developmentally it appears to us we've always been listening, but that we had to learn how to speak, we had to learn how to write, and we had to learn how to read, right? These things happen, but that we always have been listening, that we don't treat it as a skill that requires. It's also the case that if we choose to, most of us can listen very well, and that we report our excellent listening skills whenever surveyed, but that we rarely operate at our optimal levels, right? Rarely operate at them, but very little effort goes into, we just expect students to know how to listen, and we don't educate them how, and we surely don't educate them how to in a democratic society. There's other times I actually spend a bunch of time. I'm actually convinced that the long-term project, right, it's not just that I want to sort of rebalance a set of obligations between speakers and listeners by paying attention to what obligations listeners have to listen so that we can learn how to listen to other voices. I'm entirely convinced it has to be reintegrated as a democratic value in public education, let alone others. But that's only draft. Yeah. The plan is to begin the next version of the project there instead of, that was the end. That was the final claim of the original version of my attempting to describe listening habits. Now it's going to be the first claim, so it's got a long way to go. That was actually, I'm thinking about the Occupy movement, it's helpful. And just some political organizing. Yeah.
I'm not sure I have a question so much as a thought. This quote from Bickford about the riskiness of listening comes partly from the possibility that what we will hear will require a change from us, that what we hear will require change. And I was just thinking about the riskiness of hearing, for instance, like First Nations people's claims in the U.S. is that the U.S. would have to cease to exist.
Yeah, it might.
Yeah, and I think actually in prison work this has become an incredibly important claim to make. Not that Native peoples are overrepresented in prison, but that prisons have no actual claim on any Native person because it's not recognizing the sovereignty. It's like a conflict of sovereignty and so this is a different normative claim than even that comes out of other traditions like Africana philosophy, right, against mass incarceration. And that's a really, so the risk to the US is
it's true.
Existential.
Yeah, right, that we don't get to keep the land, let alone, right, some contents of our founding principles, but that we don't get to keep the land.
Which I think complicates this claim about the European masses that Fanon makes, right? The European masses could see their interests in line with the Algerians, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But, the US masses, I don't think, could see their interests in line in that same way.
Hmm.
Because it would be a displacement
Yeah.
from the US.
Yeah. Well, but so do you think the Algerians can see their interests in line with the Europeans, or just the other way around? Right? It seems like, because
Well,
it does seem like a lot of what happens
yeah.
really is, right, so it's interesting, right? So in various ways Europe removes itself from Africa, and yet, right, what do we see happening today? The relationship is still like, oh, well, you can all come here, and then they're like, oh God, why are you here? Right? Yeah. I mean, the relationship still between France and North African Muslims, right? It's nowhere near resolved. It's just shifted terrain and shifted meaning. Right? So it's not clear actually that the Europeans either found themselves in line with, as opposed to just, accepted a certain kind of defeat, or have resolved that in
No,
any
it's just
sort of way.
Fanon saw the possibility
Saw
that
the
European
possibility
masses
of
could
it.
could
Yeah.
see interests in common, and I don't think that possibility is even
Yeah.
live in the United States.
Well, right, because the Europeans were able to retreat back to France
Yeah.
in a way that it's not clear. Yeah, and that we no longer have any sort of right of return to Europe. Right? What are we going back there? I don't know that that's going to happen. Yeah. Although also even given the slaughter that's occurred, the numbers remaining, right? How much, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
We could is it possible to renegotiate actually legitimate treaties and give back portions of land?
That it would be the first time the U.S. honored
Yeah.
any of those treaties.
Yeah, I was gonna say, right, we have treaties, but it would be interesting to imagine that it's not actually, right, it would just be giving up portions of land, right, that we already have strange political relationships to that we barely own.
Yeah. There's an epistemic disagreement there.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's interesting.
that's interesting, yeah.
I think that's an interesting point, but I think it's Europe or the U.S. You do have to rethink the whole idea that, and environmental issues and so forth, that any acknowledgement of that means that the privileged skinheads have to accept less.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and rethink identity, right? Whether in Europe or the U.S.
Well, right, because even what percentage of Native Americans, indigenous people in the United States live on reservations, right? It's still only 20 or 30% max, right? Most just cities like the rest of us, right? The numbers aren't that different. So yeah, it's, I tend to work in, I'm an epistemologist in more so than I'm really even a political theorist in certain respects. And so figuring out the relationship between an epistemic injustice and a material injustice is always the sort of tricky thing, but it seems like, right, that some of this, we're never going to get at the actual material injustices if we don't get at the notion of identity, if we don't get at how we understand who we are in relation to other people.
And redefining interests, what that means.
So Danielle Allen talks a bunch about about sort of fundamental moments of distrust in the U.S. And ties a lot of it. She doesn't make a bunch of this. I think I make a bunch of this. She has this moment where she actually says, teaching children stranger danger is actually undermining democratic communication in the U.S. Right? Because we've taught, right, for now generations, we've taught children don't talk to strangers, when in fact all political organizing requires you to talk to strangers, and requires us to figure out that there's always been and there has to be some amount of turn taking. Right? At some point our interests are shared, and at other levels our interests actually clash, and there's turn taking between who gets their interests and who loses this one. But that we've gone on for hundreds of years where the same people have lost their turns, and they're not treated as if they've sacrificed their interests. Right? The African Americans have lost their needs all along, and we don't, right? So because if we actually, recognize where we have mutual interests and where we're competing, we can actually recognize when people take sacrifices. Okay, thank you for taking a hit, maybe you'll get the next one. But we haven't recognized the sacrifices that, let alone, Native Americans have made. We surely haven't attended to those. But that it's even at the level of don't talk to strangers, right? That we've inculcated ourselves as a decreasingly democratic community.
It's funny how that, so much of that is learned in children. When my son was very young, we lived near Cheeseman Park, and we'd go walking into the park, and he would walk right up to homeless people and say, "Hi, I'm Sam. This is my mom, Lucy. She's 40."
Lucy's thrilled.
But, it was like, he had no sense that, like, this is somebody that, you don't need to introduce your parents to. It's interesting being below the level of socialization to norms that we just sort of take for granted.
Yeah.
I think the environment changes that as well. I grew up in New York City. We had a friend come in from just a rural area in the South, and who was like really alarmed by the homeless people on the street, whereas
The rest of us just walk past them.
and we're just walking by, we're like, oh my God, don't talk to them, don't give them, right? Like this need to have the visibility, like, and so I think that they're almost below being strangers in that context, or they're treated as being below being strangers, because they don't even have like the potential to cease to be strangers. And so I think that environment might also, contribute as well as like age, your socialization, or anywhere contributes to who you think of as a stranger.
Yeah, right. No, that we actually have to cultivate our ears to who to listen to and who not to listen to, and whose word, right? What kinds of voices, right? What modes of speaking carry weight and which ones don't, and we put all of this sort of unrecognized work into it before we even notice it happens. So figuring out even how to undo it requires noticing deeply entrenched patterns and habits, and
Well, we have a seminar coming in a few minutes in this room, so let's thank Dr. Cusick. You can continue talking in the hall, but please take snacks with you.
yeah, I might even have. I don't know if I actually got it. Just have double look at it or not. Yeah, it's an interesting essay.
The redistribution of space.
Yeah, it's a nice focus, right? The politics of listening versus the speaking space. No, that idea of redistributing comfort and redistributing not just material resources, but redistributing comfort and risk and Oh, I can send this. Yeah, like what email? Yeah, here. I was trying to. I've got to listen. No, isn't it awful? I have put all this pressure on people. And I'm going to talk this whole time.
This camera
And make
here.
people talk about listening, and they have to listen, and they have to feel like they're doing it